Yo, yo, hey, ane, yo, hi, yo, hi, yo, hey, ane, yo, hi, yo, hi, yo, hey,
Hello, my name is Kody Grant, and I work with the American Indian Initiative here at Colonial Williamsburg. I come from two different communities, so I'm enrolled with my mother's tribe, which is the Pueblo of Isleta in New Mexico, and I'm also a descendant of my father's community, which is the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Though the Cherokee Indians are located today in western North Carolina, and another portion of the Cherokee folks are located in Oklahoma with the Cherokee Nation and the United Gidua Band of Oklahoma. I'm right here with the American Indian Initiative here at Colonial Williamsburg. So I'm joined by Talon and Martin, and for today we're doing some cooking just right across from the carpenter's yard. Here at Williamsburg, we talk about the different diverse nations that travel to Williamsburg or live near closer to Williamsburg. Throughout the 18th century, before the capital was moved up to Richmond, all throughout the colonial period, different tribes are sending delegates here to Williamsburg to engage in treaty negotiations with England through the royal representative, being the Crown's appointed governor here in Virginia. So we would see tribes like Cherokees and Creeks and Iroquois travel here, or there are many of the local tribes here in the Tidewater region, like the Pamunkey, the Nansemond, and the Chickahominy, who come very regularly to the city as subjects of the Crown after the Treaty of Middle Plantation. So they live here very regularly, coming to do business, like selling pottery and wild games and things like that at the taverns. The only Indian population that you would see here in Williamsburg are the young boys attending the Brafton Indian School near the College of William and Mary. So really, our main focus is to talk about that shared history of American Indian people and colonial Williamsburg throughout the 18th century. We're doing some cooking of many of the foods that you would find that are indigenous here to the Americas. So what you might see are some corn and hominy, some dried cranberries, of course squash. Things like corns and beans and squash make up the staple of the American Indian diet. So these are things that you'll find here pretty prevalent through our agriculture. But of course, we also have some meat and game that'll be hunted, like deer and turkey. And so when we think about these different foods in the 18th century and prior to European arrival, this is what we're eating. But after European arrival, this food starts to become integrated into what we would consider to be the modern American diet, especially when we think of things like Thanksgiving. So many of these foods that you might find on your table during this holiday time are foods that have been eaten here in the Americas for hundreds and thousands of years. So for us here, we are just continuing that process of giving thanks for the food that we have available to us. So when we think about Thanksgiving being that very special time of year where we come together and we all eat, us as American Indian people, all throughout history, have celebrated the wealth of food and abundance of game that we've had here in our homelands and gave thanks every day for the things that were available to us. Gave thanks for the labor we were able to do to work the fields and enjoy the things that we have, especially with friends and family. When we think about the modern American Thanksgiving table, it's really an amalgamation of European foods as well as foods that are found here in the Americas. When we think of things like turkey, cranberries, pecan pie, and pumpkin pie, a lot of these foods are traditional foods of the woodland folks here in the Americas. So a lot of the things that we used to eat make their way onto modern day tables. In the mornings, a lot of the times, those fires are going to get started, right, to start to cooking. Those fires that are built up are really going to be used to cook and boil up that water so we can start getting our stews ready. When we talked about that fish or that game that had been dried, that's when that meat's going to be put in there to reconstitute with those vegetables. And as the day draws on, we might take some of the coals from that fire and bring it off to the side so we can get a more even heat. Maybe we might want to fry off some meat in some skillets that we have that have been traded for. So prior to European arrival, we're also cooking in clay vessels that have been shell tempered, which gives us a good pot, a good vessel to cook in. Now also, when we think of like barbecue, very popular today, barbecuing was a very old style of cooking here in the Americas in which we might build up these racks to put some of that meat on so we can get that low, even heat going. So as the day goes on, that meat or that fish is going to start to dry out and get a good char on it. Or we're also making some simple types of bread. So those women might take some flour made out of corn, or after European arrival, we're using wheat flour, and they'll make up those doughs and put them under those clay vessels and cover those vessels with some coal, and it gives us sort of like an oven. So even in the 18th century, these different ways of cooking have us provide a different way of getting some different flavors in our diet. When we think about who's doing the cooking, we usually think of kind of a division of labor, right? So for many communities, both men and women have to know how to cook for their own sustenance. So for men, when they go out hunting, they're going to have to know how to cook some of the meat and the game that they're hunting or the food that they're gathering on their journey. But usually within the home and within the communities, a lot of cooking is going to be done by our women. So there's going to be our mothers and our grandmothers and our wives and our sisters, because a lot of the housework and the village work falls under the jurisdiction and the autonomy of the women. So when it comes to doing work like that, that's going to fall under their ownership. Because for a lot of these southeastern and northeastern woodland communities, women are the heads and the matriarchs of the household. So the things that are necessary for the care and the maintenance of the life are under their jurisdiction. So when many of the men come home, they have very little ownership of anything, if anything, except for what they make or what they use for their tools or for hunting. So because of that, all of the cooking and all the things like that not only fall to the jurisdiction of the women, but they also own that labor and own the work of that harvest.
Hi everybody, my name is Martin Saniga. I'm the supervisor for the American Indian Initiative here at Colonial Williamsburg. My community is the Saponian people from Person County, North Carolina, and Halifax County, Virginia. We were tributary tribes of Virginia, and we're doing a lot of business here in Williamsburg in the early part of the 1700s before Fort Christiana shut down, and we pretty much left and moved to the more central part of the state of North Carolina. Historically, our territory really spreads throughout the Piedmont region of North Carolina and Virginia, where we reside today. We still practice some of our traditional agriculture, language revitalization, and we still have our core community there in Person County. We've chosen these foods to show a spread of what's pretty typical here in the eastern woodlands. So along the coast, you've got mussels and fish. In the interior, you've got those game animals, deer, venison. And the thing that really unites us all is our agriculture. Corn, beans, squash, wild and fresh fruits, all of which are being kind of showcased today in our cooking.
When we think about Europeans arriving here in the Americas, they're also bringing many of their own foods and their own diets. So we can think of like domesticated animals like pigs and cows. We can also think about things like flour and then all the different spices that they're trading for from across the world. But when they're coming here to the Americas, they're receiving things through gifts, through trade, and also things and foods that they're finding here in the Americas. So when we think about this exchange of food, things like especially corn and beans and squash are also finding their way into European diets as well. So when we think about cooking in the late winter, we're also going to be wanting to dry out some of our meat and some of our fish so we can have that later in the colder months by reconstituting it in water with things like hominy and squash and vegetables that we might have preserved as well.
The biggest thing with these fresh foods is the seasonality of them. So as Americans today, we're used to getting the same ingredients year round, regardless. If it's winter, I can get avocados. If it's spring, I can get avocados. Or if it's the summer, I can still get them. For Native people, traditionally, unless that food is preserved and set aside for later, once it's out of season, it's out of season.
Atto, my name is Talon Silverhorn. I've been an American Indian interpreter here at Colonial Williamsburg for about 4 years now. I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma. In the 18th century, Shawnee people were located primarily in the Ohio Valley and the surrounding area. Today, we live down in northeast Oklahoma. The Shawnee tribe, the Eastern Shawnee tribe of Oklahoma, and the absentee Shawnee tribe are the three federally recognized bands of Shawnee. I grew up on the reservation down in Oklahoma, and from the time that I was about 3 years old, I got my first bow. I started hunting when I was about 6, and I've hunted traditionally for most of my life. This year, as a matter of fact, is going to be the first year that I've hunted with anything other than a traditional bow and arrows. So things like turkey or deer or the other things that we're smoking and preserving here are things that I've actually done for quite a while as well. The preservation techniques that we're using to do this are cold smoking and hot smoking. Cold smoking is where we're hanging usually things like vegetables just high enough above the fire that they're not receiving any heat, but they are receiving smoke. And the smoke helps to drive out moisture and to preserve the squash that were ringed up today. The hot smoking is just what you think of. It is receiving heat from the fire and smoke to help drive out moisture a little bit faster. It usually results in a little bit harder end product as well. So think about things like jerky, for example, which is exactly what we're doing today. So the meat will be cut into thin strips, hung over the fire after it's been salted a little bit to help absorb some of that moisture as well, and then rotating it to get an even heat across the entire thing, but not cooking it so that it will drive moisture out and keep it fresh for much longer. Comparing what we're doing here to modern preservation techniques, besides the introduction of electricity and automation, the techniques themselves are actually the same. So whether it be hot smoking for things like sausage or jerky, chickens, briskets, etc., that many people are fond of doing today, or cold smoking or dehydrating, we think of vegetables, squash, fruits, whether it be bananas, strawberries, pineapples, mangoes, you name it. It's the same technique. People also still salt things today as well. And so you think of, salt pork and the other things that you can find in the supermarkets. So these are the same techniques that we use today. The entire purpose of salting, smoking, or dehydrating is to remove moisture to prevent bacteria, mold, and other things like that growing inside and on the foods themselves to keep them from breaking down. So these processes will preserve these foods for much longer than fresh, near indefinitely if done right. We think about smoked and salted meats. Here at Colonial Williamsburg, we actually have a piece of ham that was smoked and salted almost 400 years ago. And they say it's still edible to this day. I'm not willing to try it. But the squashes and other meats that we're going to be smoking today will last much more than, say, like 6 months that would be necessary for the winter time. These foods in particular, meats, fish, berries, and different types of vegetables like squash, are some of the most commonly preserved foods in the 18th century. Many native tribes in the Americas are agricultural based, and so corn, beans, squash, different types of melons, gourds, and fruits are the main sort of substance of our diet. And then in the wintertime and colder months, red meats like deer or elk or bear or sometimes even beef are added into the diets to help kind of get us through the wintertime. So this is very, very common for what you would see in the 18th century to keep and preserve these things so that we can eat off of them during the colder months of the year.
The social aspect of cooking is one of the best things that I love to discuss because it's something that we don't think about even in our modern days. So sometimes food can be kind of a mundane task of just getting something in your body, right? But in other times, things like going out to eat with friends or ordering food takeout to sit and eat at home with your family or with your loved ones becomes that comforting feeling, right? We all know that feeling when we finally sit down with everybody and we get that first bite of food. In the 18th century, food is about just the same for us. So a lot of our celebrations and our festivals are widely based around food because even the work that goes into farming that land, into planting those and harvesting that food is a communal event. So the celebration of eating that food also becomes a communal event. So for us, we're going to be celebrating that diversity of food that we're harvesting, that we're eating.
For me, the biggest thing is just how much of our modern culinary tradition comes from us as Native people. Avocados, chocolate, vanilla, peppers, tomatoes, peanuts, turkey, all of these things, even our pecan pie that we're used to on Thanksgiving, and our kind of centerpiece, turkey, these are all indigenous foods and all indigenous ways of prepping them. If you've ever eaten Doritos or Fritos, you've eaten amiculaized or what we were cooking today, hominy corn, tortillas, all of those things come from us originally.
We hope that you've enjoyed your time with us today talking about these different types of foods that were found here indigenous to the Americas and how they were grown, hunted, and cultivated throughout the centuries. As you sit down at your Thanksgiving tables today, We hope you think about these people and the love and effort that went into preparing these things through the centuries. From us here at the American Indian Initiative with Colonial Williamsburg, we hope that you've appreciated your time with us today, and we also hope that we get to see you in the future to discuss these things in our culture and our life ways.